Hi, my name is Ahmad, and I'm here at the Percussion Conservatory. Today I'm going to be taking you through the 2022-2023 TMEA All-State Snare Drum Etude. So let's start by checking out the performance video first, then we'll come back and get into it. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I felt pretty good about that one too. All right, I hope you enjoyed that performance, and I hope you have the music with you with your measures numbered, because we're about to go really deep into this etude together. I'm going to take you through the beginning all the way to the end, almost measure by measure, note by note, and really give you what I think are all the tools you'll need to have a really successful, really thoroughly prepared audition. So let's get into it now. The first thing you might have noticed was I was using a 14 by 5 inch drum, so that is something I want to briefly cover here. We do have two brand new, nice, beautiful drums from Majestic here. We have the 14 by 5 and the 14 by 4 Opus 1, which is their new premier line. And I would recommend playing on a drum of one of those shell sizes. About 4 or 5 inches is going to be good. 6.5 might be a little bit overkill for a little audition like this. And the 13 by 4, even though you might think you get more sensitivity out of it, you might not get some of the power that you want for a lot of the louder passages in this particular etude. Another thing you want to notice about this in particular is it's in 3/8. The time signature 3/8 means, of course, there's going to be 3/8 notes per measure. And that's different from most of the music you've probably played so far. A lot of the music you've played so far has been in 4/4, 3/4, 2/4, other things like that. And a lot of times I'll ask my students, what's the difference between 6/8 and 3/4? They both have 6/8 notes in them. So what's the difference? And a lot of times they aren't really sure how to answer that. So the difference is 3/4 has 6/8 notes, but it's divided up into 3 groups of 2, whereas 6/8 has 6/8 notes, but they're divided up into 2 groups of 3. So a mathematician might not make a distinction between those two, equals 6 at the end of the day, but in music it feels and sounds very different. And a time signature that has 8th notes grouped in pairs of 2, we call that a simple meter. So like I said, 4/4, 3/4, 2/4 are all examples of simple meter. However, when they're in groups of 3, we call that compound meter. So this particular etude is in compound meter. And that means you're going to be counting 8th notes. So typically you count quarter notes in probably most of the pieces you played so far. Now we're going to be counting 8th notes, which means the 16th notes are going to feel and be counted like 8th notes. So you probably say 1 and 2 and for 8th notes typically. Now for 8th notes you'll say 1, 2, and for 16th notes you'll say 1 and 2 and. Another important thing about this particular etude that you might not already have known is it's actually based off a piece in the repertoire called Alvarado del Gracioso by Maurice Ravel. It has a direct quote from a famous snare drum part in the orchestra piece that appears at the end, and a lot of the same kind of rhythms and textures from the orchestral arrangement are found in this etude. It's a lot of fun to play, has a lot of lively rhythms and some flair to it. So I highly recommend you check out a couple of recordings to get in your ear the sound and style that this etude references. So getting into the actual etude now, we have a triplet in the first measure, and I highly recommend you keep your stickings consistent. Every time you have a triplet figure, I would try to play it the same way. Meaning, for example, when you have one beat of triplets, such as the first measure, I would start it personally with my left hand so that I can end on my right hand. If you feel easier to start on your right hand and end on your left, that's totally fine. I would just, like I said, take care to keep it consistent. I would also generally start all of the groups of 3 triplets with my left hand so that, again, I can end on my right hand. If you're keeping score, that means on the groups of 2, I would probably start on my right hand so that, again, I can end on my right hand. It's up to you to try and see what feels best to you, but I do think it's important to keep it consistent. On the note of sticking, there's 2 main sticking paradigms that you should know about. We call them alternating sticking or natural sticking. Natural sticking is sometimes called lead hand sticking. And the concept with alternating sticking is fairly self-evident. You simply alternate hands on the next note. So it doesn't really matter what rhythm you're playing, you just play the next note with the other hand. For natural sticking, it's a little more complicated than that. You essentially assign each part of the rhythm to a hand. So for example, in 30-second notes in this piece, which are counted as 1E and a 2, I would start with my right hand, and that would look something like this. Right? But if I had only a portion of that rhythm, like 1 and a 2, I would use the sticking right, right, left, right, because that's how it would work out. If I just took away the second note of the rhythm, I'm also taking away that same sticking that I would have used for that part of the rhythm. Getting back to triplets, you can practice them with and without accents. I think that would be very valuable to building up your fluidity and consistency with the triplets. If you know your rudiments, 2 of the very first rudiments hopefully you learned are the single stroke 4 and the single stroke 7, which are single stroke rudiments based off the rhythm of a triplet. So the single stroke 4 goes like this, and the single stroke 7 goes like this. The names are not meant to be confusing or tricky or misleading in any way. It's single strokes, and you've got 4 of them or you've got 7 of them. So a lot of the rudiments you'll find have names that are maybe even too simplistic seeming, but like I said, they're not designed to trick you at all. So single stroke 4s, single stroke 7s, just practicing your single strokes in general, but especially in a triplet sort of paradigm, is going to pay off handsomely for playing this etude well. Getting back to the piece now, in the second measure, we have a roll. And the roll, for me, I'm going to play all the same roll speeds the entire etude, which is going to be a 16th note roll speed. So again, in this 3/8 time signature, 16th notes are going to feel kind of like 8th notes from what you're used to. So in that quarter note roll in measure 2, it's only going to be 4 roll strokes like this. That's it, okay? Now, when you're practicing in a slow practice tempo, as you should be doing, your roll is probably not going to sound its best, okay? And you have to quickly get over that. It's not going to sound its best at the slow tempo, but as you get closer and closer to performance tempo, it's going to naturally fill in, okay? There are a couple of different ways people play rolls or teach rolls. Some play what's called a triple bounce roll, and some play a little bit more of a dense kind of press style roll. Either way is totally fine. Again, like I said about the sticking earlier, as long as you're consistent, it's going to sound good. If you do play a triple bounce roll, then every stroke in the roll should have exactly 3 bounces, and they should all be even rhythmically. If you play a little bit more of a dense roll, kind of a tip for you I have that I found out later on my own is getting a clean release of the roll. You actually have to slightly change your touch on the last roll stroke, meaning if they're overlapping at all, then on the last stroke of the roll, if it continues to sort of overlap into the next note, which you want to be a release, then actually you're not going to get the cleanest release and it's going to sound a little muddy. So do take care of the last stroke of the roll if you use a denser, more press style roll. You'll also notice in these first 2 measures, we have 2 different types of accents. We have an accent on the very first note, a flam, and then we have what's called a marcato accent on the beginning of the roll in the second measure. The marcato accent, to me, essentially is an even stronger accent. And I kind of think of it as an accent plus more weight, more arm weight. And for any roll that has an accent at the beginning of any type, accent normally or marcato accent, it only applies to the first stroke of the roll. So it doesn't mean the whole roll is really loud and you're yelling at me the whole time. It just means you're going to start the roll strongly, like this. You'll also notice there's an accent on the release of the roll, right? So there's a few different ways you can start rolls. course, you can start it just with the start being even with the body, like this. You can start stronger, like I showed you a moment ago, or you can kind of sneak into the roll. So those are three basic ways you can approach the beginnings of rolls. And in this etude, you actually get a chance to do all three. Starting louder than the body of the roll, getting louder through the body of the roll, and just playing a nice even roll. Another thing that you can add to your playing, even in the first line, to really set yourself apart, is this idea of microphrasing, or essentially leading to the strong beats. So again, we're in 3/8, right? Which means beat 1 of every measure is going to be the strongest beat. So for example, measures 5 and 6, they have an accent on the first note, nothing else written, but I might lead to that next first note of the next measure. So again, sounds like this. Hopefully you hear a little direction through the 16th notes. If I play it super flat, as even as I can, it'll sound like this. Sounds a little more like marching band to me. Nothing against marching band, I love drumline, but that's not this same thing we're doing here. I think if you can show a little bit of direction, it shows more maturity, more refinement, and again, it's going to start to set you apart right from the very beginning of the piece as a mature, accomplished player. In the second line, you get a chance to do one of those crescendo rolls that I mentioned from before. So you're going to get suddenly softer and drop down to piano. There's two ways I recommend you accomplish this. Of course, one is to simply play softer, right? But what does that mean? Well, to me, the simplest way to accomplish that is to use what we call stick height, which is simply a measure of how high you lift the stick off the head. So I'm going to start from a lower stick height closer to the drum on the beginning of the roll, and through the roll, I'm going to increase my stick height such that by the end, I've gotten to a louder dynamic. And take care, especially when you're practicing slowly in the beginning, that you really see each stick through the crescendo rise a little bit higher than the previous one. If you do that, you will accomplish a good crescendo. One of my old teachers used to say the definition of a crescendo is every note gets louder than the last. And if you hold yourself to being that thorough through the crescendo, it really will come across as a crescendo. The other secondary effect you can use to help color the dynamic change is your playing zone on the drum. So as we hopefully all know, the closer you are to the rim, the softer the drum is. Playing the same level, you hear the sound change and get louder. It changes in quality too, but it does get louder as I come closer to the center. We're going to use that, but we're not going to rely on that. I see way too many young players relying on the zone changes, okay? So again, you need to accomplish your dynamic changes primarily in your hands with how high you play off the drum. And then you're going to complement that by using the playing zones to again reinforce what you yourself are already doing. After crescendoing the roll, you play a nice even measure of 16th notes and then a measure of triplets leading to the last note. Here's the one exception in the piece to that rule I mentioned back at the beginning about starting the triplets with my left hand. In this case, because I want to start the roll with my right hand and then alternate through the 16 notes and triplets, I'm going to end up starting the triplets on my right hand and ending on my left. After that, in measure 13, you have 30-second notes, which are pretty fast. If you take the tempo that's marked on the page of dotted quarter note equals 80, that gets you to 8th note equals 240. So essentially, these are the equivalent of playing 16th notes at 240 beats a minute. Not slow. Okay, so you have two options here. You can use doubles and essentially play what's a 5-stroke roll, or go for the gold and play singles. I say go for the gold because it is an endeavor, okay? You probably aren't going to get it super clean the first time. And ultimately, if you have super fast hands and can play really evenly, it does have the potential to be clearer and more exciting with the singles. However, this being an audition and not simply a taped performance where you can try again, take two if you need to, then you need to get it right the first time and you need to go with something that you know is going to work. So if you're, say, a drummer in the battery at your high school and you work on doubles all the time, all day, every day, I would probably recommend you simply use a 5-stroke roll sticking. After the doubles finish in measure 17, you have one more roll to finish off the phrase and nice and strong, and then you get a subito dynamic change in 17, meaning you suddenly drop down to piano. So in measure 17, you're going to use what's called a downstroke. That's different from what you probably normally want to use, which is a full stroke. And a full stroke is where you let the stick come back. You follow the rebound and let your fingers absorb the rebound a little bit so the stick comes back. That would look something like this. You see how if I just open my hand up a little bit, I don't have to bring the stick back, it will come back all on its own. For a downstroke, I don't need to pound the stick down. If anything, that's actually counterproductive because remember, the harder I hit the drum, the harder it hits back, right? So it's sort of our instinct, it's kind of human nature to think, okay, stop the stick, down, and bury it, right? That's the exact opposite of what you want to do because again, it's only making things harder for yourself. It's also making a worse sound, but mechanically, it's the opposite of what you really need to do. All you need to do is begin like a full stroke and then catch the stick at the bottom. You're going to catch it by engaging your back two fingers primarily, which act as a resistance to that rebound that the stick naturally experiences. So that would look something like this. You notice I didn't have to hit the drum hard at all. I just let the stick drop, and then after it's done, I simply keep my fingers there in my palm and I catch the stick. You're also going to push out and use those playing zones that I mentioned earlier so that you can get not only a softer sound from your stick height being lower, which you accomplished by a successful downstroke, but you're also going to get a lighter, thinner sound out of the drum and have a huge contrast here. And that's really important in snare drum playing, dynamic contrast. We all know snare drum does rhythm well, right? But one of the things it does better than any other instrument in the orchestra is also dynamics, right? I can play louder than almost anyone else on stage, but I can also play softer than any clarinet or flute player could ever play. So we have a huge dynamic span, and we want to make sure we're really showing that off as much as we can in our audition. Now, after completing your downstroke, you're going to have a gradual crescendo. You'll notice in the music it says poco a poco crescendo, and that means little by little get louder. Some students have been a little confused by this because the crescendo isn't printed until measure 22. So some people have thought, oh, the crescendo doesn't start until 2 measures before the fortissimo. Is that right? No, it's not. It actually begins where you see poco a poco, the line above. So I do want to point that out. There's been some confusion about that. The crescendo does start at the end of measure 18. Now here at measure 18, you have a repeated rhythmic figure. And this is another rhythm I wanted to talk about, really beginning in 17. You have a dotted eighth note. There's a lot of confusion amongst younger players about what the dot does to the rhythm. The dot makes the rhythm longer, essentially, but it makes it longer by a precise amount, and it depends on what rhythm it's altering. So if it's attached to an eighth note here as a dotted eighth note, it's going to make it longer by 1/16th note. What the dot does is it adds half of the original rhythm's value. Or if you like multiplication better, it's like a multiplier times 1.5. It's the same thing at the end of the day. So if you have a dotted quarter note, you'll notice like in measure 9, measures 9 and 10 actually, then that takes up the whole bar because it takes up 3 eighth notes, right? So another kind of trick or way you can simplify it in your head is it takes up 3 of the next fastest rhythm. So if it's a dotted quarter note, it takes up 3 eighth notes. If in here, measure 17, it's a dotted eighth note, it takes up 3 16th notes, the next rhythm below in the rhythmic tree. Now you'll notice on beat 3 of measure 17, there might be something you haven't seen before or you're a little unsure of how to interpret. That's called a tie. And a tie simply adds the second note of the rhythm to the first note. So that means you're not going to play the second note. In measure 18, again, you do not play the downbeat. You add that 16th note's value to the previous eighth note at the end of measure 17, essentially again turning it into a dotted eighth note. However, we can't write a dotted eighth note because we run out of room, right? There's only room for 3 eighth notes in a measure, again, 3/8, and we can't do that. But to achieve the same rhythmic effect, we can tie the next note of the next measure to the last note of measure 17. Now, as far as pacing this crescendo, it's actually quite nice that you have these repeated figures because when you have a repeated figure through a long crescendo, you can use that as a nice gauge to check mark and make sure every time you play that figure, it's just a little louder than the last time you did. If you really are careful about doing that, your crescendo is not going to seem rushed at the end, and it's going to seem very inevitable. I like that word for gradual crescendos. It just feels right. There's no other way it could go. You know, each one is a little stronger until you reach the peak in measure 24, and then you suddenly drop down again in measure 25 to mezzo forte. Here, again, I would push out towards the edge a little bit on the drum so that you not only get a softer sound, but a lighter sound to really change the color. That'll go a long way to avoid sounding a little brutish. There's a lot of loud playing in this etude, so any chance you get to show off a little softer, more delicate control I highly recommend you take advantage of it. After the mezzo forte drop, you'll notice you have another accent. So you have an accent in measure 25, which is still in that fortissimo dynamic range. Then the next measure, on beat 1 again, you have another accent on measure 26. These might look the same on the page, accent, accent, play them equal. That is not the case. In this setting, we're going to play the accents within the dynamic that we are currently in. So if we're in mezzo forte, the accent also has to be less than the fortissimo accent that came right before it. So just take care to separate those sounds so that you have a better shot at showing your dynamic control. Measure 27 begins a repeated rhythm again. It might be a little tricky to figure out what that rhythm is. It's like this. Again, for you drumline folks, that probably sounds very familiar, like the exercise double beat, classic one. So in this case, you could play it like double beat and use all right hands, or if you're a lefty, all lefts, like this. Nothing wrong with that at all. I would recommend you don't use this kind of flow sticking like this. Okay, that might turn into starting to sound a little swung, a little like you're changing the strong beat, and a little disorienting. So to get a consistent sound, I would use a consistent sticking again. Now, here's the first errata, okay, the first change to the printed music. If you already have this marked in your music, great. If not, take care to add a crescendo through measures 29 and 30. These are the two measures with the untied rolls. Untied rolls are different from all the other rolls we've had so far. If you notice, all the other rolls we've had so far have one of those ties we mentioned briefly before. And in a rolls case, the tie means you play all the way until the next note, and you play the next note as well. You release the roll. However, these are untied, or there's no release. So there's going to be a little space, a little gap between each sound. And to do that, you can either play 2 strokes per roll or 3 strokes per roll. I find I kind of gravitate towards 3 strokes for the way I play my roll, but if you play a little juicier, longer, denser style of roll, I think 2 would work great too. Again, I think it just needs to be consistent. You have a little breath or lift between each one. That's all you need. However you accomplish that, your business. Now you only get to forte in measure 30. That's another change from the printed music. It's originally fortissimo, and out of the blue, it's this big interruption in the original etude. Here, he's kind of smoothed it over and made it a gradual crescendo. So it also has every note as a marcato accent. To accomplish that without being just monstrously loud, I would actually play near or maybe even in the center of the drum. So that's going to give it a different color, a punchier sound, and that way you can get that effect without being overly loud. You add a fortissimo at the end of that crescendo, 32, measure 32, so that way you have a clear ending point. You never go beyond fortissimo in this piece. Now in the next measure, you drop down to mezzo piano and again have an accent to the start of the roll. Again, this just means the first note of the roll is accented, right? And then now finally we get to the famous 4-stroke ruff. There's only one in this piece, okay? But it does need to sound crisp and clear and exciting. 4-stroke ruffs are something snare drummers love to obsess about because they are cool. And you have a couple regular ruffs on the second page too, and we'll cover them here because the way I approach them is very similar. They're not the exact same, but they're pretty close and you'll see what I mean. So for a regular ruff, I do want it to actually be 2 small notes attached to a big note, exactly as it's printed on the page. So some people might advise you to do basically a buzz or crush stroke, something like this, where you don't really hear clearly the number of grace notes. It's just kind of a long zoobop sort of sound, which to me is not very attractive or inspiring or crisp and snare drummy, right? Sounds a little lazy to me. So I want to shorten those notes up and make sure it's a clean double, like this. So you have 2 notes for grace notes and then a main note. Now the way I'm going to approach the 4-stroke ruff is I'm going to leave the last 3 of the 4 the exact same as what I just played for a regular ruff. I'm just going to add a small little pickup on my right hand. So that sticking would be right, left, left, right for me. Again, for my drumline folks, that's called a puttada. You probably practice a lot of puttadas, right? So it's a puttada sticking like that. Just like with your flams, the setup is key. So you'll notice I start with my left hand for my sticking a little higher than my right, right? And I also end with the biggest stroke so that it has a little crescendo and direction and growth through the figure. The next thing to think about with a 4-stroke rough is how fast to play it, because it is 4 notes through time. It's not notated as a rhythm, but notes through time is essentially the definition of rhythms. So it's some kind of rhythm, whether you know it or not, so you might as well make it a rhythm by choice. So the rhythm I would recommend is a 30-second note triplet. That sounds fast because it is. So you're going to essentially use the same rhythm for measures 17 and 18, where you think of the first note of the 4-stroke rough as a 16th note on the upbeat of beat 1. So the check pattern between measures 33 and 34, if I get rid of the roll and I get rid of the inner notes of the 4-stroke rough, would sound like this. Like 1 and 2 and 3 and 2. Okay, once you get comfortable with that, you can add the roll back in, so it sounds something like this. And then finally, you can add that little double on the left hand back in so that the whole figure is complete. Okay, now one other note about the roughs in general is I'll try to kind of lift my double hand off the drum. That does, in my mind, 2 things. Number 1, it helps ensure that you're not going to get stuck down for that long, kind of sloppy buzz sound that we covered earlier. We want to avoid that. Number 2, it gives you an opportunity to maybe get that second stroke a little stronger, okay? Kind of a brighter, shorter, more leading sound. So you can kind of engage the middle finger a little bit. It's a timing thing, you have to practice, but you can engage the middle finger a little bit, support the second note of the double, so that it, again, has, even in the regular rough, a little growth, a little crescendo, and a little direction through the figure. Now, this particular 4-stroke rough also has a marcato accent on it, so if you want to add a little extra dimension to your playing, you could also come in on the head towards the center of the drum, not in the center, but in a little bit, maybe half an inch at the most, so that, again, the release of the 4-stroke rough is clearly the strongest and sounds different from the other notes. In measures 37 and 38, again, you have a repeated figure through a crescendo. So I would take care to make sure each of these starts of the rolls are a little stronger than the last, something like this. So that it's no doubt, especially in a short crescendo like that each one is a little stronger. Then in measure 41, you have the biggest dynamic drop in the piece. Fortissimo marcato accent to pianissimo flam, the very next note. Here, the mastery of that downstroke technique is going to be your best friend. There's no other way to accomplish this, really. You must stop the stick low. I'm also going to push out towards the edge of the drum, and I also recommend you keep all of these flams on the same hand. Again, consistent sticking for a consistent sound. So all of those flams would look something like this. So you'll notice that my right hand is growing in stick height. My left hand isn't much, really. It's just kind of moving along with it. That ensures that the grace notes stay light. If I kind of grow both hands, it turns into something a little more like this, which maybe isn't the sound that you're after, okay? Now, the stroke types you have to use for same hand flams like that are also really easy. It's just full strokes in one hand and little taps in the other grace note hand. If you alternate flams, which I love to do, it's very fun, but if you alternate flams, you have to use downstrokes and upstrokes, which are much more technically challenging and are going to probably lead to inconsistencies. So I highly recommend you use either your right hand if you're right-handed or left hand if you're left-handed for every main note and every flam in this passage. In measure 48, the next line, you have a basically mirror image of the last flam passage, where now you're going to start loud and get a little softer, a little lower, and a little closer to the edge with every single note. Then, in the last measure of the piece, you have pianissimo 30-second notes. So here, I do really recommend you do the double sticking. Even if you think you've got really fast hands, my singles are great. At this point, you've been playing for a while, you might be a little tired, and it's way safer to go for doubles, okay? There's no shame. No one can see you behind the screen. It just has to sound clean and clear, okay? So I highly recommend you practice your 5-stroke roughs in a soft dynamic near the edge, and you still have to play fast singles for the triplets at the top of the next page in measure 55. So you're gonna have to work on your soft singles and doubles to really pull this passage off successfully. Now, the next line is one of the trickier rhythmic passages in the piece, I would say. You have a lot of 16th rests, which you really have to feel very rhythmically. You can't kind of slur these together. It's very easy to step ahead and step over the rest here, and you want to make it feel very grounded and rhythmic. This also leads us to the next bit of errata. We have 2 added flams on the marcato accents in measure 63 and 64. So again, if you want to give a little more distinction between the accents and the marcato accents, which is what you do want to do, you might want to play the marcato accents a little closer to the center on the drum so that you get a little different sound, and it's just very clear that you have total control over what you're doing. Now you have a roll in the next measure, 65, that does not have an accent. Most of the rolls so far have had an accent. So I would also try to take care to be a little chill on that first note of the roll so that, again, it just sounds different and clear and like you want. The next line has the next and final bit of errata. The last measure of the third line, measure 71, has a huge diminuendo all the way down to pianissimo for the downbeat of measure 72. I imagine Dr. Lane chose to do this out of the kindness of his heart because it's going to give you a much better start to the pianissimo roll in measure 73 by already being there a measure before, and you can really place that nicely. And you do want to practice the starts of your soft rolls. So to practice the start of your soft roll, you really just need to practice one soft roll stroke at a time. Make sure from the very beginning of the stroke it has the right texture, volume, density, all those things that you're after. Even though I play a triple bounce roll at the louder dynamic, I do play a denser, more pressed style roll at softer dynamics. I think it gives it way more fullness of sound, and really at the loud dynamic, the drum is ringing at least a little bit. So you can get away with not so many strokes and still have sound going. At the softest level, the drum really doesn't ring much. So the main portion of the sound, if you have a well-tuned drum, should be the snares. And the snares only respond essentially as the stick is hitting the drum. So we want the stick to be in contact longer with the drum so that the snares vibrate longer and you get a smoother, fuller buzz sound. You have 2 long rolls in this piece. You have the 3-measure roll from pianissimo to forte and the 4-measure roll from piano to forte. So they have different lengths and different starting places. You have to be sure that you pace them appropriately. The first roll is a crescendo that gets louder much faster. It starts softer and has less time to get loud. The second measure starts a little louder and has more time. So you want to make sure you don't get too loud too soon on the second roll. That's going to be a common issue I've heard already. In measure 86 and 87, we have a couple more of those untied rolls where, again, the same strategy will work. Either 2 or 3 strokes, your preference. Try both out, see what you think seems to sound best for you, and just go with that. Now here in measure 89, we finally have the famous Alvarado quote. It is a direct quote from the orchestral piece, and it starts at fortissimo, lasts for 5 bars, and quickly dims all the way to pianissimo through only 1 measure, okay? You only get 1 measure to get all the way down as soft as you can. So for me, part of what makes this clearer is adding a little bump or a little pulse at certain key moments and not just playing super flat like a robot. I recommend that you lead through the triplets to the big beats. So for example, measure 90, I wouldn't just play all even. I would kind of give, especially the third group of triplets, a little direction to the ending note, which would sound something like this. Okay? If you've heard the piece, you'll hear that kind of shape over and over and over again. And that's what you want to imbue here, is a little direction, musicality, clarity. Now, in measure 95 and 96, when you're playing very soft and very fast, especially if you have a poorly tuned drum, it's easy for this to just turn into a blur. No rhythmic clarity at all. That's the last thing you want, because even if you play it perfectly in time, if the audience or judges can't understand it, you get no credit. So anything you can do to play clearly here is going to be in your best interest. And I found that adding a little bump, not an accent, a little bump or a little pulse on the downbeat of measure 96, the big beat again, just kind of reinforces the time, okay, to the audience. Again, be careful that it's not a big accent because you do have actual accents in the following 2 measures. So just a little bit to show that the time continues, and then that actually also gives you a little more wiggle room to play the accents a little stronger. Remember, the accents are still within our dynamic range of pianissimo here, but a little stronger so that you can separate out your kind of added bumps for clarity versus your printed accents. Also notice there is an accent at the top of this giant hairpin. You have 2 measures coming up, 2 measures going down, and don't be bashful about really whacking that note, okay? It needs to be very clear. And again, it's going to turn into a blur if you're even a little bit, round with the shaping. I think it should be quite sharp actually. And a little trick I like to do, which I'm giving it away now, right? But a little trick I like to do is however soft you end, measure 103, you have all these triplets going by super fast, right? As soon as you get to the end of that, play the next 2 measures even softer, okay? They're gonna be like, wow, he ended that soft? No, I didn't. I actually got even softer after the hard part. But it's gonna seem like, wow, he got that soft. So I'll show you what I mean. I'll start from measure 101, the top of the crescendo, and I'll get, as soft as is comfortable at the end of the triplets. And then for those 16th notes that follow, I'm gonna get even softer. And it's gonna seem like, wow, he ended so soft. Maybe even play a little softer on the second one too. Now take really good care of the time here. You have 2 full measures. Every judge has nothing else to do but simply count along here. And if you're not coming back in on time, it's just unsettling, I'll say, okay? It's a little jarring, You're expecting it to come in one time and then it comes in before you're ready and you have to readjust your interpretation of the time and kind of catch up to them. And it's a little frustrating of a comment to get. I understand. I used to get, the rests, aren't in time. And I used to be a little annoyed about that maybe. It's like, well, what about the playing? Come on, But the rests are really important to the listener. And so you have to make sure that you play the rests with just as much diligence as the actual notes. Okay, now here in measure 107, we're finally at the recap, okay? The recapitulation, like the exact beginning of the piece, right? Should look very familiar to you, hopefully. I would say try and make this even more exciting than the beginning, right? We talked about having some of that flair and direction through the triplets in the beginning. I would do that even more this time so that now it sounds like an ending, right? The other difference is in the 5th and 6th measure of this phrase, the first time you had accents on the downbeat. Here there are no accents, but there is a written crescendo. So you want to make sure that you pace yourself appropriately so that you're not giving it away too soon and you have nowhere to go. And the last thing I would say to really, maximize this crescendo is the last roll. So far, I even made a point to say I play all my rolls the same roll speed, right? 16th notes. The very last roll of the piece, I actually might throw in a 5th stroke. So that would make it technically a quintuplet, I suppose. But you don't need to overthink it. I would throw in a 5th stroke so that it has a little more zip and really go for a big note on the end. Don't be shy or bashful about that at all. You can really give it a stinger that's totally appropriate here, okay? So I hope that gives you a lot to think about. There's a lot that you can show in this piece. It's got lots of technical challenges. Playing triplets that fast with that much, dynamic contrast is a challenge. I don't care who you are, it's fast, right? But once you're rolling with that, you can bring so much musicality and detail to this piece. And that's why I think it's an excellent choice for this year's 2022-2023 All-State Snare Drum Etude. Have fun with it. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you do too. And it's been a blast coming here to the Percussion Conservatory. Thank you so much.